The royal road had been blocked for 3 hours. 3 hours, and not a single warrior in the king's procession had managed to move the creature by even 1 step. Mara heard the commotion before she saw it. She had been checking the boundary markers at the eastern edge of Ashenvale Forest, her boots soaked through from the morning frost that still clung to the grass in thick silver sheets, her breath rising in small clouds that dissolved into the cold air of early autumn. The sounds that reached her were not the usual sounds of a passing caravan. The rhythmic clatter of hooves on stone, the creak of wagon wheels, the low murmur of travelers relieved to be moving through the forest quickly and without incident. What she heard instead was shouting, commands being issued and ignored, the sharp crack of something large striking the earth. And beneath all of it, a silence that pressed outward from a single point, the kind of silence that happens when something ancient decides to make itself known. She came through the tree line and stopped. Before her, filling the width of the Royal Northern Road with a presence that seemed to bend the light around it, stood Iron. She recognized him immediately, though she had only ever seen him once before, when she was 12 years old, and had wandered too deep into the forest during a winter storm, and had found herself face to face with those enormous dark eyes. She had not been afraid then. She was not afraid now. But the men in front of her clearly were, even if they would have died before admitting it. The King's Royal Guard, 12 warriors in silver and black armor, stood in a fractured line approximately 30 feet from the elk, their horses refusing to go closer. 3 of the horses had thrown their riders entirely and retreated to the far edge of the road. The elk himself stood absolutely still, his antlers rising above his head like the bare branches of an ancient oak, each point sharp and dark as iron. He was the largest living creature Mara had ever seen. His shoulders stood taller than any of the horses. His coat was the deep brown of old heartwood, and where the morning light caught it, it seemed almost to move, like the surface of dark water. His breath rose in long, slow columns of mist that drifted upward and vanished. Behind the wall of guards, the royal procession had come to a full stop. Wagons, carriages, horses, and riders stretching back along the road for what Mara estimated was nearly a quarter-mile. And at the center of it all, still mounted on a horse that was managing its fear better than the rest, only through what appeared to be sheer stubbornness, sat a man whose face she could not yet see clearly, but whose stillness told her everything she needed to know about who he was. He was not shouting commands. He was watching. That alone set him apart from every other person on the road. "Get it to move," one of the guards was saying, his voice tight with frustration that was trying very hard to sound like authority. "Use the spears if you have to. His Majesty cannot be delayed any further." "We have tried the spears," another guard said, and Mara could hear in his voice the particular quality of a man who has done something embarrassing and is hoping no one will ask him to elaborate. "It does not respond to the spears." Mara looked at the elk. Iron had not moved. He was not threatening. He was simply there, in the way that mountains are simply there, in the way that the river is simply there, because he had decided to be, and nothing in the world had the authority to tell him otherwise. She stepped forward. "What are you doing?" One of the guards turned and saw her, and his expression moved rapidly through surprise, irritation, and dismissal before settling on the particular brand of contempt that men in armor reserve for people they consider to be beneath their notice. "This is a restricted area. Stand back." "I work this road," Mara said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "I am the forest warden assigned to this section of Ashenvale. My name is Mara Voss, that is Iron, and he is not going to respond to spears or commands or anything else you have tried. So I would suggest you let me through before you lose another 3 hours making the same mistakes." The guard stared at her. She could see him doing the arithmetic of the situation. Her rough canvas jacket, her mud-caked boots, the simple iron pin at her collar that marked her as a border warden of the lowest rank, a position one step above invisible in the hierarchy of the Northern Kingdom. She was not someone whose opinions were supposed to matter. She was not someone whose words were supposed to carry weight. "Stand back," he said again. Mara walked forward anyway. She heard the guard make a sound of indignant disbelief behind her, and felt rather than saw him reach for her arm. She sidestepped without looking at him, which seemed to offend him more than anything else. Could have, and kept walking. She heard other voices rising behind her. She heard one voice in particular, low and carrying the natural weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed, without needing to be loud, say 2 words. "Let her." And the guard stopped. Mara kept walking. 30 feet. 20. She did not slow her pace. She did not look away from Iron's dark eyes, which had found her the moment she stepped onto the road and had not moved since. 10 feet. 5. She stopped when she was close. Enough to see the individual hairs of his coat, close enough to smell the deep forest and cold earth scent of him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body like a banked fire. She said nothing. She simply stood there and let him look at her. The sound that came from the elk was not a sound she could have described to anyone who had not heard it. It was not a bellow, and it was not a cry. It was something lower and older, something that resonated in the chest before it reached the ears, the way certain notes of music seem to bypass the mind entirely and settle directly into the body. And then, with a slowness and deliberateness that made it unmistakably intentional, Iron lowered his great head. His front legs bent. The enormous animal knelt, his antlers sweeping toward the ground in what could only be called a bow, and the silence that fell over the entire road was so complete that Mara could hear her own heartbeat. She heard from somewhere behind her a single sharp intake of breath. She reached out and placed her hand against Iron's forehead, between the base of his antlers, where the fur was softest. He held absolutely still beneath her touch. She could feel the pulse of him under her palm, slow and ancient and sure. She stayed like that for a moment, and then she stepped to the side of the road and gestured toward the forest beyond, toward the deep path that only the elk and the forest wardens knew. Iron rose. He turned. He walked into the trees. Without looking back, and within moments the forest had swallowed him completely, as if he had never been there at all. Mara turned around. Every person on that road was staring at her. The guards, the riders, the people in the wagons who had leaned out to see what was happening. And at the front, on the dark horse that had managed its composure better than all the rest, the man she had glimpsed before was now close enough that she could see his face clearly for the first time. He was not what she had expected. She was not entirely certain what she had expected, but it was not this. A man who looked as though he had been made from the same materials as the forest itself, sharp and dark and quiet, with eyes the color of winter water, and a face that gave away nothing except, in this moment, a single thing she could not quite name. He was looking at her the way people look at something they have seen before in a dream, and are only now recognizing in waking life. He was looking at her as though she were a problem he had not anticipated and could not immediately solve, and she understood somehow that being an unsolvable problem was not something this man encountered often. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. "Your name," he said. His voice was exactly as she had imagined it from those 2 words. Low, controlled, carrying the particular quality of a man who does not waste language. "You said it was Mara Voss." "Yes," she said. "You are a forest warden." "Yes." "Of what rank?" She saw no point in pretending otherwise. "The lowest." Something moved in his expression, too quickly for her to read. "And Iron," he said. "You have met him before." It was not quite a question. "Once," she said, "when I was a child. And he knelt for you then as well." She hesitated, because the truth was something she had never told anyone, not because she had been hiding it, but because it had simply never seemed relevant, Yes, she said. He did. The man on the dark horse was quiet for a moment. Around them, the road had begun to stir again as people realized the way was clear, as horses settled, as the machinery of the royal procession began to find its rhythm again. But no one moved. Not yet. Everyone was waiting for him. "I am Aldrich," he said. "King of the Northern Realm." She had known, of course. But hearing him say it directly, without title or announcement, as though it were simply a piece of information she needed to have, was different from knowing. "Your Majesty," she said, and inclined her head. "You will ride with the procession," he said, "at the front, in case there are other difficulties along the road. I have work to finish on the boundary markers," she said. The stillness that came over him then was not quite displeasure. It was the stillness of a man recalibrating. "The boundary markers," he repeated. "Yes. They cannot wait." She thought of the 3 markers that had been disturbed, probably by the storm 3 nights ago, and how if they were not reset before the next moon cycle, the boundary wards would weaken, and the things that lived deeper in Ashenvale than Iron would begin to drift closer to the road. "No," she said. "They cannot." Another silence. And then, from behind the king, a voice cut through the air like a blade wrapped in silk. "Aldrich, darling, surely the warden can attend to her little markers after we have passed. We have already lost the morning." The woman who had spoken was riding a pale horse and was dressed in deep blue that precisely matched the color of the sky above the tree line. She was extraordinarily beautiful in the way that certain things are beautiful when they have been carefully and deliberately constructed to be so. Symmetrical, composed, every detail exactly right. Her hair was dark and dressed with small sapphire pins that caught the light. Her eyes, when they found Mara, were the particular shade of pale blue that manages to convey warmth while communicating something considerably cooler beneath it. "Lady Isolda," the king said, and his tone held a quality that Mara could not quite interpret. Not deference and not dismissal, something carefully positioned between the two. "The road is clear now," Lady Isolda continued, addressing the king, but keeping her eyes on Mara with the focused attention of a woman cataloging a threat she has not yet decided how seriously to take. "There is no further need to delay the procession, unless of course the King of the Northern Realm requires the assistance of a border warden to navigate his own roads." The last words were perfectly pleasant. They were also perfectly precise in the way they were designed to diminish. Mara felt the familiar weight of that kind of dismissal settle onto her shoulders, the kind she had been carrying since she was old enough to understand that she had no clan name, no wolf, no rank above the floor of the hierarchy. She was used to it. She had learned, years ago, to let it pass through her like wind through bare branches, present and then gone, leaving nothing behind. But the king was looking at Lady Isolda now, with an expression that Mara could not read at all, and when he looked back at Mara, his face had settled into something neutral and decided. "Attend to your markers, Warden Voss," he said. "Then report to the northern gate of Ashenvale Keep this evening. Someone will be expecting you." He did not wait for her response. He turned his horse and the procession began to move, and within minutes the road was filled with the sounds of horses and wheels, and the low conversations of people relieved to be moving again, and Mara stood at the edge of the trees and watched them pass and felt, for the first time in a very long time, as though the world had just shifted beneath her feet in a way she had not been prepared for. She did not know then what that shift meant. She did not know that the king's scholar, an old man named Perrin, who had spent 40 years studying the ancient texts of the northern bloodlines, had seen everything from his carriage window and had gone very still, in the way that very old men go still when they see something they have spent their entire lives reading about and had never expected to witness in person. She did not know that he had opened the leather satchel at his feet and removed a book whose spine was so worn the title was no longer legible, and had turned to a page he had read so many times the paper was soft as cloth, and had read a single passage with shaking hands. "And the great elk of the ancient wood shall bow to none but the blood of the first forest. And when that bow is given, it will be a sign to all who witness it that the lost line has returned." She did not know any of this. She went back into the trees and fixed her boundary markers, and tried not to think about the king's eyes, and almost succeeded. The northern gate of Ashenvale Keep was a tall arch of dark stone that had stood for 400 years and looked like it intended to stand for 400 more. Mara arrived as the last light was leaving the sky, her hair pulled back, her jacket exchanged for the only other jacket she owned, which was marginally cleaner and only slightly less worn. She had taken time to wash the mud from her boots, which she was now regretting because the path to the keep had been wet, and the mud had found them again anyway. She stood before the gate and wondered if this was a mistake. She wondered if she had misunderstood. She wondered if she should simply turn around and go back to her small house at the edge of the warden station and pretend that the morning had not happened. The gate opened before she could decide. The man waiting on the other side was not a guard. He was old, with a scholar's stoop and a scholar's preoccupied expression, and he was looking at her with an intensity that reminded her, unexpectedly, of Iron's gaze, as though she were something he had been waiting to see for a very long time. "Warden Voss," he said. "I am Perrin, the king's historian. Please come in. We have a great deal to discuss, and very little of it will be comfortable, so I suggest we begin immediately." She came in. The room he led her to was a library, or had been at some point. Now it looked like a library that had lost an argument with a map collection. Every surface was covered with charts and documents and open books, and in the center of it all, seated at a long table with a cup of something hot that he was not drinking, was Aldrich. He looked up when she entered, and she had the same disorienting sense she had felt on the road, that he was recognizing something in her that he had not expected to find. "Sit down, please, Warden Voss," Perrin said, clearing a chair of 3 heavy books and a rolled map with the efficiency of a man who does this often. "And tell me, have you ever heard of the Voss bloodline?" "It is my family name," she said, sitting. "My father was a warden before me. His father before him. As far back as anyone can trace. As far back as anyone living can trace," Perrin said, with a precision that made her look at him more carefully. "Which, it turns out, is not very far at all." He sat across from her and set his old book on the table between them, open to that page she had not seen him read, the page with the passage about the elk and the first forest and the lost blood. "The Voss name," he continued, "appears in the royal genealogical records in a place that I do not think you will have expected. May I show you?" She looked at the king. He was watching her with that same unreadable steadiness. "Show me," she said. What Perrin showed her took the better part of an hour to explain. The short version, which Mara requested at the 40-minute mark because her head was beginning to ache with the weight of 6 centuries of bloodline charts, was this. 300 years before the current kingdoms had taken their current shape, before the 7 clans had divided the land between them, there had been a different kind of power in the north. Not the power of alpha wolves and pack hierarchy, but something older. The power of those who had first made the compact with the forest itself, who had not simply lived alongside the ancient creatures of Ashenvale, but had spoken to them, guided them, shared their world with them by right of blood. That line had ended, or had been believed to have ended, when the last daughter of the first forest had disappeared during the Wars of Division. The histories said she had died. The ancient texts, the ones Perrin had spent 40 years studying, said something different. They said she had simply become invisible. She had taken a warden's name and a warden's life and had walked into the trees and kept walking, and the world had moved on without noticing that it had lost something. Irreplaceable. She had children, Perrin said, and they had children, and so on, through 3 centuries, until this morning, when Iron looked at you and went to his knees, and I realized that the lost line was not lost at all. It had simply been forgotten. Mara sat with this for a long time. The room was quiet. The fire in the hearth crackled and shifted. Outside, the wind moved through the stones of the keep with a low sound that was almost like breathing. "You are telling me," she said, finally, "that I have a claim." "Not a claim," Perrin said carefully. "Something more than a claim. The ancient texts do not speak of rights or titles. They speak of recognition. The forest does not grant power. It recognizes it. And Iron has recognized you twice, which in the 400 years since the last confirmed sighting of the great elk has never happened to anyone." She looked at the king. "And what does this mean for you?" she asked. It was a blunt question. She did not know how else to ask it. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "It means," he said, "that the ancient accords between the crown and the forest bloodline must be honored. By law older than any of the 7 clans, if the blood of the first forest is confirmed, the crown is obligated to provide protection and recognition." "And if it is not convenient?" she asked. "If the timing is, for example, poor." His expression shifted, just slightly. "Nothing about this is convenient," he said. "But inconvenience has never been sufficient reason to ignore the law. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below." Mara was given a room in the keep that was larger than her entire house. She stood in the center of it for a long time after the servant who had shown her there had left, and looked at the carved wooden furniture and the heavy curtains and the fire already burning in the hearth, and felt like a woman standing in someone else's life wearing her own shoes. She did not sleep well. She lay in the enormous bed and listened to the sounds of the keep settling around her, and thought about Iron's dark eyes, and the way the king had looked at her on the road, and about the woman on the pale horse with the sapphire pins in her hair, and about the passage in Perrin's book, and none of it resolved itself into anything she knew how to hold. In the morning, the difficulties began. Lady Isolda Vane had been at Ashenvale Keep for 2 days before the royal procession arrived, having ridden ahead with her own smaller retinue. She was a guest of the keep by long-standing arrangement, and her rooms were on the same corridor as the king's private chambers, a fact that Mara learned from one of the younger servants who had been assigned to help her navigate the keep's considerable and confusing geography, and who delivered this information with the careful neutrality of a person conveying something they know to be significant without taking any personal position on its significance. Lady Isolda had been the assumed future queen of the Northern Realm for approximately 3 years. Not officially announced, not formally contracted, but assumed in the way that things are assumed when powerful families align their interests, and enough people of importance nod to each other in the right rooms. The 7 clans recognized the match. The noble houses had adjusted their expectations accordingly. Several smaller kingdoms had sent early congratulations. Mara was aware, standing in the corridor outside the great hall on her second morning at the keep, that she had walked into the middle of something whose shape she did not fully understand, wearing a borrowed gown that fit her almost correctly, and carrying the weight of an ancient bloodline she had not known she possessed 24 hours ago. She was also aware, with the practical clarity that comes from spending years alone in a forest where being wrong about something could get you killed, that Lady Isolda was not going to simply accept the disruption. She did not have to wait long for confirmation. "Warden Voss." The voice found her in the corridor outside the great hall, and when she turned, Lady Isolda was there, dressed in pale gray that managed to look simultaneously simple and extraordinarily expensive, with 2 of her ladies walking several paces behind her at the precise distance that indicated they were present as an audience, but not as participants. Lady Isolda herself was smiling, and the smile was a remarkable piece of work, warm and genuine-looking, and containing within it, for anyone who was paying close attention, the message that this conversation was going to be conducted with perfect courtesy, and that this was, in its way, more dangerous than anger. "Lady Isolda," Mara said. "I wanted to welcome you to the keep personally," Lady Isolda said, It must be very strange for you, being suddenly thrust into these surroundings. We are delighted to have you, of course. Perrin's discovery is extraordinary, though I imagine, for you, it is rather overwhelming. It has been a great deal to absorb, Mara said carefully. Of course it has. Lady Isolda's sympathy was perfectly calibrated. I only hope that you are not placed under any undue pressure. The ancient texts are fascinating naturally, but scholarly enthusiasm can sometimes lead to expectations that are, shall we say, disproportionate to circumstances. She paused, and in the pause fitted the blade. A bloodline, however ancient, is not the same as a life prepared for these responsibilities, is it? The role of those connected to the crown requires a great deal of experience, of knowledge, of understanding, particularly of politics and alliance, things that take years to acquire. She smiled again, the same warm and precise smile. I only say this because I would hate for you to be put in a position where expectations outrun reality, and then to be hurt by the inevitable disappointment. The king is a man of duty. He will do what the old law requires, but duty and choice are not always the same thing. And I think a woman as sensible as yourself understands that distinction. Mara looked at her for a long moment. She understood every word of what had just been said, and the architecture beneath the words, and the intent beneath the architecture. She had grown up invisible. She had spent her entire adult life being spoken to as though her feelings about it were irrelevant. She knew precisely what Lady Isolda was doing, and she also knew, with a bone-deep clarity she could not have explained, that she was not going to pretend otherwise. I appreciate the welcome, she said. I appreciate it especially because I know it cost you something to offer it. That suggests to me that you are someone who understands how to do difficult things gracefully, which is a quality I respect. She paused and allowed herself one precise moment of honesty. I am not here to take anything that is not mine by right, but I am also not planning to make myself small because it would be more convenient for someone else if I did. I have been doing that my whole life, and I find I am finished with it. Lady Isolda's smile did not waver, but something behind it did. How refreshing, she said. How very refreshing. And she walked away, her ladies falling into step behind her, and did not look back. Mara stood in the corridor and breathed, slowly and carefully, and told herself that she had not just made things significantly more difficult for herself. She was not entirely convincing. The days that followed had a quality she had no previous experience to compare to. She met with Perrin every morning for lessons, the history of the forest bloodline, the ancient accords, the specific properties of what he called the forest sense, the particular attunement to the living world that was, he explained, not magic in the way most people understood magic, but something more like memory, a cellular knowledge of the natural world that had been bred into her line over centuries of living in close contact with Ashenvale and its creatures. This, he told her, was why she had never been afraid of Iron. Not because she was brave, though he thought she probably was, but because some part of her had always known him. Some part of her had always known the forest, in the way that you know a place you have been before, even when you cannot consciously remember having been there. She met with the king less often, and by design rather than accident. She felt this clearly, the way you feel a current beneath calm water. He was managing the distance between them with deliberate care. When they did encounter each other, in the great hall at meals or in the corridors of the keep, he was correct and courteous and spoke to her with a specificity that told her he had been paying attention to what Perrin reported from their morning sessions. He asked intelligent questions. He listened to the answers with the focused stillness of a man who is accustomed to receiving large amounts of information and knows how to sort it efficiently. And he watched her, with that same quality she had noticed on the road, as though she were a problem he was working through in the background of whatever else he was doing, patient and thorough, and not yet ready to arrive at a conclusion. She told herself she was not watching him in return. she was not particularly convincing to herself on this point either. On the 5th day, one of the younger wolves from the king's personal guard, a man named Soren, who had the open face and easy confidence of someone who had never had reason to question his place in the world, made a point of sitting near her at the evening meal and talking to her with a warmth that was genuine and uncomplicated and refreshing in its simplicity. He was curious about her life in the forest, about Irene, about what it felt like to spend years as a warden with no knowledge of what she carried in her blood. He was funny, in the straightforward way of someone who has discovered that humor is a good way to make friends and has deployed it consistently ever since. Mara found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time since she had arrived at the keep, and the relief of it was physical, like setting down something heavy she had been carrying without noticing. She was aware, across the length of the great hall, that the king's attention had shifted toward their corner of the room. She was aware of it the way you are aware of a change in light, not looking directly at the source, but feeling it nonetheless. She did not look up. She kept her eyes on Soren and laughed at something he said about the time he had tried to bluff his way through a survival test in the northern woods, and had ended up extremely cold and very humble, and told herself that the warmth she felt from across the room was simply the fire. She was not convincing herself about this either, and she was becoming increasingly irritated with herself about that. On the 7th day, Perrin told her about the Festival of the Pure Moon. It was held every 7 years, he explained, during the autumn moon cycle, when the light was fullest and most particular, and it was the oldest ceremony still practiced in the northern realm, predating the current kingdom by at least 2 centuries. In its original form, it had been a gathering of the forest bloodline families, a renewal of the compact between the First Blood and the living world of Ashenvale. Over time, as those bloodlines had faded and the memory of them had been absorbed into general supernatural tradition, it had become something different, a ceremony of pack recognition and clan alliance, at which the gathered alphas of the 7 clans confirmed their oaths to the crown, and the crown confirmed its obligations in return. It was, in the current era, primarily political. It was also, he added, with the care of a man, delivering information he knows will not be welcome, the occasion at which the king had been expected to announce his formal betrothal. "When is it?" Mara asked. 3 weeks from today, Perrin said. She sat with this. "And the betrothal," she said. "That would be to Lady Isolda." "That has been the expectation," he said. "For some time." "And now?" Perrin looked at her over the tops of his reading glasses, with the expression of a man who has spent 40 years studying things that other people would prefer not to think about, and has developed a certain comfort with uncomfortable truths. "Now," he said, "there is an additional complication. The ancient texts are specific on this point. At the Festival of the Pure Moon, any confirmed descendant of the forest bloodline has the right to invoke the covenant of first blood. It is not an aggressive act. It is simply a formal acknowledgement, before the gathered alphas and the living forest, of who they are. The compact is renewed. The recognition is made, and in making it, the descendant's status is formally established, beyond the reach of any clan objection or political negotiation." He paused. "The last time the covenant of first blood was invoked was 340 years ago. I have been waiting my entire career for this." "And the king?" she asked. "Does he know about the covenant?" "He knows everything," Perrin said. "He has always known everything. That is both his great quality and his greatest burden." She thought about Aldrich on his horse on the road, watching her walk toward Irene. She thought about the way he had said, "Let her," with those 2 quiet words that had stopped a guard mid-reach. She thought about the careful distance he maintained and the focused quality of his attention when he allowed the distance to close. She thought about a man who knows everything and says almost nothing, and carries the weight of what he knows in the particular set of his shoulders. And she understood. Something she had been trying not to understand for 7 days. The difficulty was not that he felt nothing. The difficulty was precisely the opposite. She went to find him that afternoon. She did not plan to. She was walking in the keep's inner courtyard, which was where she went when the stone walls felt too close. And she turned a corner and he was there, standing at the far end of the courtyard near the old fountain that had been dry for years, reading something in a small book that he closed and set aside when he heard her footsteps. "Warden Voss," he said. "Mara," she said, "please." Warden Voss sounds like someone is in trouble. Something shifted in his expression. That small seismic movement she was learning to watch for. The one that meant he was adjusting to something he had not anticipated. "Mara," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice did something to the air between them that she was not going to examine directly. She sat on the edge of the dry fountain, because standing felt suddenly like too much effort. He remained where he was, and she appreciated this. He did not move toward her, but he did not back away either. He held the space between them steadily, like a man who has made a decision about that space and intends to honor it. "Perrin told me about the festival," she said. "I expected he would." "And the covenant." "Yes." She looked at him. "You knew what that elk meant the moment you saw it." He was quiet for a moment. "I had read about it," he said. "I had not expected to see it. Not in my lifetime. But you knew." "Yes." "And you brought me here anyway," she said, knowing what it would complicate. "I brought you here," he said, "because the ancient law required it. And because leaving you on that road, after what I had just witnessed, was something I found I could not do." The courtyard was very quiet. The wind had dropped. Somewhere above them, a bird called once and went silent. "Lady Isolda," she said, "is a political alliance," he said, "and a person I respect. Those two things are both true. And the betrothal announcement, at the festival." He looked at her for a long moment. "There are things," he said slowly, "that I have known my entire life I would do because they were required. Alliances made for the benefit of the realm. Decisions taken not because they were what I would have chosen, but because they were what duty demanded. I have never resented this. I have always understood that to be king is to hold the shape that the kingdom requires, even when that shape is uncomfortable." He stopped. She waited. "And then," he said, "you walked toward an ancient elk that had defeated 12 of my best warriors. And you were not afraid." And he went to his knees. And I understood in that moment that I had spent my entire life making decisions for the kingdom and had never once accounted for the possibility that something I could not choose away might find me anyway. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. She did not say anything for a long time. The fountain was dry, and the stone was cold beneath her, and the keep rose around them on 4 sides, old and heavy and full of history, and she felt simultaneously the smallest and the most seen she had ever felt in her life. "I am not asking you to choose," she said finally. "I want to be clear about that. I am not going to be the thing that breaks what you have built. I know what I am. I know what I come from. I have spent my whole life being the person no one accounts for, and I will not use an ancient bloodline to make demands I have no right to make." "You have every right," he said, and something in his voice had changed, the controlled quality of it shifting slightly toward something underneath. "That is precisely what the covenant exists to establish. Rights are not the same as choices," she said, and heard, as she said it, the echo of Lady Isolda's words from the corridor, turned inside out. Lady Isolda had meant it as a diminishment. Mara meant it as something else entirely. He was quiet for a long time, and then he crossed the courtyard and stood before her, and she had to look up to meet his eyes. And what she saw in them was the thing she had been trying not to see for 7 days. Not a king managing a political complication, but a man standing at the edge of something he had not planned for, and finding, to his own evident surprise, that he was not. Afraid. "There are 3 weeks until the festival," he said. "I know," she said. "A great deal can change in 3 weeks." "Or not change at all," she said. "I have learned not to count on change." He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought she saw something that might, in a man less restrained, have looked like pain. "You have been very well trained to expect nothing," he said. "By whom?" "By everyone," she said simply. "By my whole life." He was quiet again. She had not expected. And then he did something. He sat beside her on the edge of the dry fountain, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold autumn air. And he did not look at her, but looked instead at the gray stone walls of the courtyard, and said, "My wolf has not been restless in 11 years, not since my mate died, before I became king. I had thought in those 11 years that it had simply accepted the absence, that it had found a way to be still." He paused. "It has not been still since." The morning on the road. She understood exactly what he was telling her. She felt it in her own chest, that pull she had been trying to name and had been failing to name because she had no framework for it, no experience of this particular thing. The deep animal certainty of connection, the sense of recognition that bypasses the mind and settles in the blood. She had felt it on the road when he had said, "Let her." And she had felt it every time their eyes met across a room. And she had been telling herself it was gratitude or fascination, or simply the disorientation of a completely new life arriving without warning. She had been lying to herself, and she had known it, and she was very tired of it. "This is complicated," she said. "Extraordinarily," he agreed. "Lady Isolda is going to do something," she said. "I do not know what, but I know her well enough after one conversation to know that she is not going to wait for 3 weeks to pass without acting." "Probably not," he said. "Isolda is very intelligent and very thorough, and she has worked very hard for a very long time. She will not accept this disruption gracefully." "And you?" she asked. "What will you do?" He turned and looked at her directly, and the winter water eyes were very close. And she felt her breath do something complicated. "I will do what I have always done," he said. "I will try to do right by everyone, and accept that this is not always possible." He paused. "And I will not pretend to myself that I feel nothing. That is the one thing I am apparently no longer capable of." She looked at him for a long time, and then she looked away, because looking at him directly for too long felt dangerous in the specific way that standing at the edge of something very beautiful and very deep is dangerous. Not because it will harm you, but because you might decide to jump and not regret it, and that is its own kind of peril. The following days moved with a strange doubleness. On the surface, the ordinary rhythms of the keep, meals and meetings and lessons with Perrin, and the gradual, careful process of learning to inhabit this new version of her life. Underneath, the current she could feel building toward the festival, pulling everything slowly and inevitably toward the moment of decision. She and Aldrich saw each other daily now, less by accident, and more by a kind of quiet mutual agreement that neither of them had stated explicitly. And what passed between them in those encounters was not the uncomplicated warmth she felt with Soren, but something far more charged, far more careful. Two people moving around something enormous that they could both feel but had not yet named aloud. Soren, who was observant in the way that people who appear unserious often are, said to her one afternoon when they were walking the upper ramparts, "You know that half the keep is watching the two of you." "I know," she said. "And the other half is watching Lady Isolda watching the two of you." "I know that, too. And you are not going to do anything about it." "I do not know what there is to do," she said honestly. Soren was quiet for a moment, looking out over the forest below, the dark canopy of Ashenvale stretching to the horizon like a second sky, full of its own weather and its own rules. "He has not looked at anyone like that since Calla died," he said. and his voice had lost its easy humor, was simply quiet and direct. I have served him for 9 years. I know what he looks like when he is managing something, and what he looks like when something is managing him. The morning on the road, when you walked toward Iron, I was watching his face. I have never seen his face do what it did in that moment. He paused. I am not telling you this because I want you to do anything with it. I am telling you because I think you are a person who needs to know things in order to be brave, and I think you are going to need to be very brave in the next few weeks. She thought about this for a long time after he left. She thought about bravery and what it required, and the difference between the kind of bravery that faces an ancient elk without flinching and the kind that faces your own heart without looking away. The thing she had not counted on was Isolda moving as quickly as she did. On the 10th night, 3 days after Mara's conversation with Aldrich in the courtyard, she woke in the deep hours before dawn to the sound of voices in the corridor outside her room. She lay still and listened, because wardens are trained to listen before they move. And what she heard resolved itself into 2 voices. One she recognized as belonging to one of Isolda's ladies, and one she did not recognize at all, low and careful, and speaking in the particular rhythm of someone delivering rehearsed information. She caught fragments. Her name, a phrase about the ancient texts, something about proof, something about a challenge. She got up. She did not reach for a candle. She opened her door very quietly and found the corridor empty, the voices gone. But on the floor outside her door, she found a small folded piece of paper that had been pushed under the gap at the bottom. She took it inside and lit her candle and read it. It was a single sentence, written in a hand she did not know. They are going to challenge the bloodline before the festival. She sat with this for the rest of the night, and in the morning she went to Perrin. The challenge of bloodline, he explained, was an ancient provision within the same texts that described the covenant of first blood. If any alpha or noble of sufficient standing formally contested the claim of a forest bloodline descendant before the festival, a proving had to be called, a formal test, witnessed by the gathered pack, in which the descendant's connection to the living world of Ashenvale would be demonstrated beyond question. It is not designed to be a trap, Perrin said carefully. It was designed as a safeguard against false claims. But it can be used as a weapon by someone who understands the mechanism and believes the claim cannot be substantiated. And can it, she asked, be substantiated? He looked at her. That depends entirely on you, he said. What you carry in your blood is not a story or a document. It cannot be proven with paper. The only proof the ancient law recognizes is the proof of the forest itself. A descendant of the first blood, when brought to the heart of Ashenvale and called upon in the formal language of the covenant, will either be recognized by the living world or will not. There is no middle ground. And if the living world does not recognize me, then you are not who the texts say you are, he said. And the challenge succeeds, and the claim is void, and you return to your life as a warden. He paused. But Mara, Iron knelt. He knelt twice. I have read every account of every encounter with that animal in 400 years of documented history, and he has never knelt. For anyone. Not once. Not for the greatest alphas of the 7 clans. Not for kings. Not for anyone. He met her eyes. He knelt for you. The forest already knows what you are. The proving will know it too. She heard in this what he was not saying, that he was almost certain, and almost was the word that stayed with her, turning over and over, for the rest of the day. The challenge was delivered formally 3 days later. It came from a Lord Cairn of the Westfang clan, an old ally of Lady Isolda's family, and it was phrased with careful legality and perfect courtesy, and the clear intent of a document written by someone who had spent a great deal of time with a very good lawyer. Mara received it in the presence of Aldrich and Perrin and 2 of the king's senior advisors, and she read it in silence while the room waited, and she handed it back to Perrin and said, I accept. Aldrich looked at her. A challenge accepted with certainty is already half answered, she said. And she meant it, mostly. The part of her that was not mostly was the part she was managing very carefully, and intended to continue managing until it was no longer necessary. He came to find her that evening, alone, without ceremony or guards, in the way that he had been finding her in the evenings with increasing frequency since the conversation at the fountain. A man who had decided something and was acting on it by degrees, one deliberate step at a time. They walked the inner corridor together, which had become a kind of habit, the keep quiet around them in the late hour. You did not have to accept immediately, he said. I know. You could have taken time to consult. I know that too. Mara. He stopped, and she stopped with him, and they were standing in the narrow corridor with the stone walls close on either side and the torches burning low. And he was looking at her with that expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when he had run out of the patience required to be indirect. Are you afraid? She thought about telling him she was not. She thought about all the years of being the person who was expected to be small and quiet and not take up space, and how part of that had required learning to perform fearlessness because showing fear invited contempt. She thought about how tired she was of performing anything. Yes, she said. I am afraid. I am afraid that the forest will know me, and that will be terrifying in its own way. And I am afraid that it will not. Know me and everything Perrin believes will be wrong, and I am afraid of what happens after, regardless of which it is. I have been afraid for 10 days. I have simply been choosing not to let it stop me. He looked at her for a long time. And then he did something she had not anticipated. He reached out and took her hand. Not the way Soren had touched her arm in easy companionship. Deliberately, fully, his fingers closing around hers with a steadiness that felt like the promise he could not yet make in any other way. That is not fear, he said quietly. That is courage. They feel the same from the inside, but they are not the same. She looked at their hands. She looked at his face. She thought about Lady Isolda, and political alliances, and the 7 clans watching, and the ancient law, and all the enormous complicated machinery of the world that surrounded this single moment, this single quiet corridor, this one man holding her hand in the late hours of the night, as though it were the most natural and necessary thing he had done in years. Aldrich, she said. I know, he said. I know all of it, and I do not have answers. What I have is this. He did not let go of her hand. Whatever comes from the proving, whatever is decided at the festival, I need you to know that what happened on that road was not simply a political complication for me. You were not simply a complication. You have not been, since the first moment, something that I could manage from a distance, and I am very good at managing things from a distance, so please understand what I am telling you when I say that I cannot do it. She closed her eyes for just a moment. She felt the warmth of his hand around hers, and the cold of the stone corridor, and the deep pull in her chest that she had stopped trying to name, because it did not have a name she could use without admitting everything. I have never had anything that was mine, she said. Not truly. My life in the forest was mine, but only by default. Because no one else wanted it. I have never had something I chose, or something that chose me. She opened her eyes and looked at him. I am trying very hard not to want things I do not know how to hold. Then, perhaps, he said, it is time to learn. She did not answer him, but she did not let go of his hand either, and they stood there in the quiet corridor for a long time, and it was enough, for now, and they both knew it was not enough, and they both knew that 3 weeks was not very long, and that it was going to feel very long indeed. The proving was set for the week before the festival, at the heart of Ashen Vale, at the place the oldest maps marked only as the Rooted Grove, which Perrin explained was the ancient center of the forest, where the compact between the first blood and the living world had originally been made. To reach it required a full day's walk from the keep, through forest that became progressively older and denser and quieter as you moved. Inward, until the trees were so large that their trunks were wider than rooms, and their roots rose from the earth in great curving arches that you could walk beneath. The light changed in there. It came down through the canopy in long angled shafts that seemed almost solid, and the air had a quality that Mara had only ever felt at the deepest edges of her patrol routes, alive, attentive, aware in a way that had nothing to do with the animals that moved through it, and everything to do with the forest itself. The formal party that made the journey included Mara, Aldrich, Perrin, Lord Cairn, and 2 of his clan witnesses, and 4 of the King's Guard. Lady Isolda had not come. This surprised Mara, and then, upon reflection, did not surprise her at all. Isolda was too careful to be present at something she was not certain she could control. She would wait. She would be ready for whatever came back. They walked in relative silence. Mara was aware of Lord Cairn watching her from a careful distance throughout the journey, the way a man watches something he has bet against, and is beginning to reconsider. He was older than she had expected, with a grayness around his temples, and the particular weathered quality of a wolf who has spent a great deal of time in the north. He did not seem cruel. He seemed more than anything like a man who had agreed to something because it had seemed straightforward at the time and was now becoming less certain. Aldrich walked beside her for most of the journey and said very little, which she had come to understand was not indifference but the opposite. The particular quality of his attention when he was most present was often the quietest. She could feel him beside her, the way you feel a fire in a dark room, not touching, but warming everything in the space. They arrived at the rooted grove as the afternoon light was beginning to angle, and even the King's Guards, who were trained not to react to anything, went still when they entered it. She had not been here before. She had not known it existed, specifically, though some part of her, she realized now, had always known there was a center, a place that all the forest paths bent subtly toward, the way all rivers ultimately bend toward the sea. The grove was a clearing within the ancient trees, circular and precise, in a way that felt too exact to be accidental, the great roots framing its edges like the walls of a room built by something with patience beyond any human measure. At the center was a stone she could not have described to anyone who had not seen it, not carved, not placed, simply there, as though it had grown there, dark and smooth and very old, and around it the grass was a green so deep it was almost black, and the air above it seemed to move differently than the air around it, slower and more purposeful, as though breathing to a rhythm she could almost hear. She walked to it without being told to. Behind her she heard Perrin begin to speak in the formal language of the Covenant, words she did not entirely understand, but felt in her chest as though she had heard them before, in a very early memory, or in a dream. Lord Cairn's witnesses were murmuring to each other. The guards had gone quiet. She placed her hands on the stone. What happened next, she would spend the rest of her life trying to explain to people, and never quite succeeding, because language was not built for this particular experience. The closest she ever came was this: imagine remembering something you did not know you had forgotten. Imagine the moment of recognition when you see a face you have not seen since childhood, and your body knows it before your mind does. That rush of cellular certainty. Imagine that feeling applied not to a face, but to the entire living world. The trees and the roots, and the deep soil, and the water moving far below the earth, and the creatures that moved through the darkness under the roots, and the birds at the canopy, and the wind that moved. Through all of it, and all of it knowing her, all of it turning toward her the way a field of flowers turns toward light. And in that turning, in that recognition, a sound rising that was not a sound, but a feeling, a vibration that moved through the stone, and through her hands and through her chest, and settled somewhere near her heart, and did not leave. Iron came out of the trees. He walked into the grove with the same deliberate calm he had shown on the road, and this time there was no procession watching, no guards with spears, no Lady Isolda on a pale horse. There was only the grove and the stone, and the people gathered at its edge, and the elk who walked to her and stood before her, and went to his knees for the third time, and held there while the forest breathed around them. She heard Lord Cairn say very quietly, "I withdraw the challenge." She heard Perrin make a sound that she suspected was the sound a man makes when 40 years of scholarly faith are confirmed. She heard Aldrich, even quieter, say nothing at all. When she lifted her hands from the stone and turned around, he was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Unguarded, entirely, in a way that told her the walls he maintained with such careful discipline had simply failed, in this moment, to hold. He was looking at her, the way Iron had looked at her, with recognition. The deep, uncomplicated recognition of something that has been searching without knowing it was searching, and has suddenly stopped. She crossed the grove to him. She stopped within arm's reach. She did not know what to say, and so she said nothing, and for a long time the sound of the forest around them was everything. He said, very quietly, "You know what this means." "Yes," she said. "It will not be simple." "I know. Lady Isolda will not accept it without a fight. The Westfang clan will need managing. 3 of the 7 clans are going to have political objections that will take months to resolve. And you will be asked, by everyone, in every room, at every moment, to justify your presence and your right and your place. And it will be exhausting and sometimes humiliating, and you will never fully stop being the person they did not expect." She looked at him steadily. "I know all of that," she said. "I have been that person my entire life. The only difference now is that the forest has said loudly what I already knew quietly, and I am not going to pretend that it has not." She paused. "I am asking you what it means for you." He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached out and touched her face, very gently, with the same deliberateness with which he did everything. A choice, consciously made, by a man who had been managing the distance between them for 3 weeks and had decided, in the rooted grove of Ashenvale, with the forest watching and the ancient stone warm at their backs, that he was finished managing it. "It means," he said, "that I am going to have several very difficult conversations, and that what I have been pretending I was not feeling since the morning on the road is apparently the sort of thing that cannot be pretended away, and that the bond I thought was gone when Calla died has apparently been waiting, which is something I had no words for, and am still finding words for." He looked at her. "And it means that I would like, very much, to stop finding reasons to stand at a distance from the only person who has made the forest. Move in 11 years, she breathed, slowly, carefully, in and out, the way you breathe when you are standing on the edge of something enormous and choosing, deliberately, to step forward. She stepped forward. He closed the remaining distance, and the grove was warm around them, and Iron rose from his knees and turned back into the trees, and the ancient stone was quiet, and the forest knew, and the world shifted again, and this time she did not try to stand against it. The festival of the pure. Moon arrived on a night so clear the stars looked close enough to touch, the autumn sky a deep black above the assembled gathering of the 7 clans, alphas and nobles and warriors and scholars, hundreds of people gathered in the great field at the north of Ashenvale Keep, where the torches burned in long rows, and the moon above the tree line was so bright it cast shadows. Mara stood at the edge of the preparation chamber, and breathed, and told herself she was ready, and the part of her that had spent a lifetime being invisible told her she was not, and she told that part to be quiet, and it listened, mostly. She was wearing deep green, the color of the deep forest, because Perrin had found a text that said the forest blood had always worn green at the covenant ceremonies, and she had decided that she might as well be correct about something so specific if she was going to be terrifying about everything else. Her hair was down. She had no sapphire pins. She had no jewelry at all, except a single small ring of dark iron that Perrin had found in the archive and had told her, with barely contained excitement, was the last remaining piece of the forest bloodline's ceremonial regalia. A ring that had been in the archive for 260 years, waiting for someone to have the right to wear it. It was a small thing, plain and old, and it fit her perfectly, and she had looked at it on her finger for a long time before she had gone to get dressed. Lady Isolda was there. She had arrived at the festival already there, already composed, already placed with the precision of a woman who understands that position is power and that visible composure is its own kind of declaration. She was dressed in silver, and she was beautiful, and when her eyes found Mara across the preparation yard, they held the expression of a woman who has been dealt a blow she had not anticipated and has decided to absorb it with grace, because the alternative is worse. Mara looked at her and felt something that was not entirely unlike respect. Whatever Isolda was feeling, she was managing it with a discipline that Mara, who understood the cost of that discipline from long experience, could recognize and honor. Isolda held her gaze for a moment, and then she nodded, very slightly, very precisely, and looked away. It was not friendship. It was not forgiveness. It was, Mara thought, something that did not have a clean name, an acknowledgement between two women who had both wanted something. Very difficult, and had each, in their different ways, done what they had to do, and now would have to find a way to exist in a world that had not gone entirely according to either of their plans. The festival began at moonrise. The 7 alphas gathered in a half-circle before the king's dais, and the ancient words were spoken in the old tongue, and the oaths were given and received, and the torches burned and the moon climbed, and the assembled thousands watched in the particular hushed attentiveness of people present at something that will be described and re-described for generations. And then Aldrich stepped to the edge of the dais, and the hush deepened, and he looked out over the assembled gathering and said, in the clear, carrying voice of a man who has something important to say and is certain of it, "Before the formal announcements of this festival are made, I call upon the covenant of first blood to be acknowledged. By the ancient law of the northern realm, the presence of a confirmed descendant of the forest bloodline must be recognized before any other business of the gathering. I present, under the witness of the 7 clans and the living forest of Ashenvale, Mara Voss, confirmed by iron of the ancient wood, confirmed by the rooted grove, confirmed by the challenge of Westfang clan and the subsequent withdrawal of that challenge. She is of the first blood. The compact is renewed." The silence lasted exactly long enough for the words to settle into the bones of everyone present. And then, from the tree line, Iron came. He came out of the dark trees and into the torchlight, and the crowd parted before him without anyone having to be told, because there are some things you simply know to do. He walked through the gathered thousands to the edge of the dais where Mara stood, and he stood before her, and he was so enormous and so quiet and so absolutely certain, and he went to his knees for the 4th time, and the gathered alphas of the 7 clans were very still, and the crowd was very still, and the moon was very bright, and the forest was watching. Mara placed her hand on Iron's forehead, between the base of his antlers, where the fur was softest, and she felt the pulse of him beneath her palm, and she lifted her eyes to Aldrich, who was watching her with that expression she had last seen in the rooted grove. Open, certain, decided. And she thought about being 12 years old and standing alone in a winter storm and not being afraid. She thought about a morning on a road and the sound of "let her" spoken quietly enough to stop a guard. She thought about a dry fountain in an autumn courtyard and a hand closing around hers in a corridor at night, and the forest waking up under her palms like something that had been asleep for a very long time and was finally ready to come home. She thought about being seen. Really seen. For the first time. The first alpha to go to one knee was the eldest of the 7, a great gray wolf named Doran, who had been alpha of the Stoneback clan for 40 years and whose opinion moved mountains. He went to his knee slowly and deliberately, and the sound it made, an old man's armor settling against the earth, was the loudest sound in the field. And then the others followed, one by one, each in their own time, until all 7 alphas of the Northern Realm were kneeling, and the crowd around them had gone so quiet you could hear the torches burning and the wind in the distant trees and nothing else. Aldrich stepped down from the dais. He did not kneel. He walked to her and stood before her, and took her hand from Iron's forehead and held it between both of his, and said, in a voice that carried because the night was so quiet, "The betrothal announcement I was expected to make tonight will not be made. I will make instead a different announcement, one that is not required by law or duty or political alliance, one that I make because I have spent 11 years being very good at managing necessary things, and I have discovered that there are limits to management, and that the ancient forest sometimes knows something the king does not, and that I would like, before all of you and before the living world of Ashenvale, to ask the woman confirmed by the first blood and recognized by Iron and found by me in the most inconvenient and irreversible way possible, whether she is willing to begin." Mara looked at him. She thought about all the things she had believed. About herself, the things the world had taught her, that she was invisible, that she was without rank or name or right, that she was the person no one would think to account for. She thought about how wrong the world had been, not because of any document or declaration, but because the forest had known from the beginning, and Iron had known, and some part of her had always known, and she had simply been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. "Yes," she said, simply, clearly, without hesitation, with all of herself present in the word. "Yes." He brought her hand to his lips, and the moon was brilliant above them, and Iron rose from his knees and stood beside them for a moment, warm and enormous and absolutely certain, and then turned and walked back toward the trees, toward the dark heart of the ancient forest that had been waiting 300 years for this night. And he did not look back, because he did not need to. The compact was renewed. The blood was recognized. The lost line had come home. And in the great field at the edge of Ashenvale, before the 7 clans and the gathered thousands and the autumn moon that was brighter than any moon she had ever seen, Mara Voss, who had spent her entire life believing herself to be nobody, stood in the torchlight beside the king of the Northern Realm, and understood, finally and without question, that she had always been exactly who the world was waiting for. She had simply been in the forest, doing her job, waiting. Without knowing she was waiting, for the morning when everything would change. And when it came, she had not been afraid. She had walked toward it, as she had always walked toward the things the world called dangerous, with her head up and her eyes open and her heart, for the first time, completely unguarded. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?